Morning, morning.
Hi.
Welcome back to the Matcha Lover's Guide to the Universe. What are you drinking there?
Well, three guesses. I'm drinking matcha.
Kampai as we get started on our second
Uh-huh.
episode. Yeah, so today what I'd like to talk about is continue the conversation on COVID-19.
hmm
Last episode we went into some history of pandemics and plagues. We talked about some of the most significant pandemics throughout history and how this current COVID-19 compares to other pandemics in the past. Uh, we talked about what COVID-19 is, where we believed it originated, and how it's transmitted. So we really went in depth with COVID-19. Before we go into part two of the episode, where we talk about how to stay healthy, I want to talk about an interesting fact that you told me about. When COVID-19 first started spreading in the US, the fear was that a massive amount of cases would be reported coming in from China and the West Coast. And of course, the first reported cases did in fact take place in the Seattle area, but it was the New York tri-state area that was actually hit the hardest. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that the virus came in through the East Coast from Europe, and I think it was people who were infected coming from Europe, and the same thing seems to happen in Canada. It was Eastern Canada, Quebec, and Ontario that had the high numbers of cases, and British Columbia on the West Coast has had very low number of cases.
Much of the conversation surrounding COVID-19 is mostly focused on contracting it and what happens after you develop symptoms. I think that leads to some fear and uncertainty. And mainly what I mean by that is that we hear a lot of talk about how bad it will be, but we don't hear very much talk about preventive measures or methods that we can use to strengthen our immune system um, on an individual level and also as a member of society, especially when we're in close proximity to other people. I want to talk about some measures that we could take to protect ourselves and strengthen our immune function. So as you may know, obviously many of the states are reopening, which means that a lot of people are going back to work. A lot of people are going back to the doctor's office, back to the grocery store. Can you give us some basic measures that we could use to help protect ourselves as we go back into society as a whole?
Well, the measures are the same as those to keep yourself well and healthy in general. So that means good nutrition. I recommend an anti-inflammatory diet with lots of fresh produce, getting adequate rest and sleep, regular physical activity, um, learning and practicing methods of neutralizing harmful effects of stress. Of course, taking all the sensible measures of social distancing and hand washing and so forth. But a lot of these things, these are just general measures that you do to be healthy anyway.
Right. So, what do you feel about wearing masks or not wearing masks, and what's the advantage of, and then what's the disadvantage of, if you know of any?
Well, there are different kinds of masks. The very high tech ones, the N95s, I think are useful for protecting healthcare workers. Other kinds of masks, I think, offer the wearer some protection, but I think they are especially useful at protecting other people. You are protecting other people from the aerosolized droplets that come from you when you're talking, let alone sneezing or coughing. And I see in all the anti-mask protests that I see around the country, I don't think people get that. It's not that you're having to wear a mask. It's something that you do out of concern for other people's welfare.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I don't spend a whole lot of time on Twitter, but occasionally I'll look at it. And there was a comment on there where people were talking about, wearing masks, don't prevent you from getting
hmm
COVID-19. And it was from a pretty well-known person. And it got me thinking there's so much misinformation out there in regards to that. And I pointed out the fact, that it's protecting other people in case you have it yourself. So I just thought that was really interesting that that's the take that even educated
Yeah.
people have on it. So um, now on an individual level, before we go into preventive measures and practices to strengthen your immune system, can you tell us what the immune system is?
Well, the immune system, it's not so easy to visualize it the way you can the cardiovascular system or the digestive system because um, it's not one organized thing that hangs together that you can do a picture of. It's a collection of various organs, tissues, circulating cells. So it consists of organs, including the tonsils, adenoids, thymus gland behind the breastbone, spleen, appendix, lymph nodes, also the bone marrow, the circulating white cells, and other cells that move through tissues. So all of this is part of this system of defense that the body has.
And then,
And by the way, if I just a little aside here, this is something that I wrote about in one of my early books, I think on health and healing. We really didn't have a concept of the immune system until relatively recently. When I was in medical school in the 1960s, I was taught that the appendix was a functionless organ. That the tonsils and adenoids had no function. They were vestigial, left over from evolution. And that gave surgeons license to take them out. The thymus gland, which is the master gland where lymphocytes go to be trained to recognize, foreign things, it does a lot of its work in early childhood and adolescence. It shrinks. And Western doctors interpreted that as meaning the thymus had no function, and also gave license to, destroy it. They invented a condition that every child had called thymic hypertrophy, meaning the thymus is too big, which was treatable by bombarding it with X-rays, which make it shrink right away. Really dumb. And then it turns out that one long-range consequence of that treatment is that people have a much higher risk of thyroid cancer, decades later. So interesting. Now, at the same time, in Eastern medicine, people didn't know about the thymus and the appendix and the internal structure of the body, but they had a very clear concept dating thousands of years ago that the body had a defensive sphere of function, and that they explored nature to find ways of enhancing that. And a lot of the mushrooms and herbs that are used in Chinese medicine to strengthen the body's defenses actually do, in fact, increase white blood cell function and so forth. So just interesting, those two different ways of looking at things. Anyway, it was not until really in my lifetime that the immune system was really understood as this collection of organs and tissues and circulating cells that work together. And the main job of the immune system is to differentiate between self and non-self, to recognize things that are threats, and to, whether they're internal or external, and to be able to take care of them.
That's fascinating. Do you think that we put enough emphasis on boosting our immune system, or do you think it's just a catchphrase that we all talk about?
Well, first of all, I think we have to be very careful about using that phrase, boosting immunity, because you don't want to boost immunity non-specifically, because if you upregulate immune function, you run the risk of developing allergies, autoimmune conditions, and long range, maybe even worse things. And with COVID-19, and this was also true of the 1918 flu, the way that most people died from that was from an overreaction of the immune system, something called a cytokine storm, that somehow the virus provoked the immune system to go into such high gear that it caused lungs to fill up with fluid, and people drowned in their own secretions. So in that circumstance, you probably want to suppress immune function, not boost it. So I want to be careful about using that idea of strengthening or boosting the immune system. You want to modulate the immune system. So some aspects of it you want to see work better. Some you may want to keep in check.
That's a great distinction, because I think that word boost gets thrown around quite a bit. And in relation to COVID-19, like you said, it's probably not a good idea to do that. So what are some natural basic ways that you can stimulate your immune system or fortify it against?
Well, COVID-19? All the things that I mentioned, look, I mentioned the stress management. We know that the major stress hormone, cortisol, directly suppresses immune function. So you want to keep cortisol low in your body, and you do that by practicing relaxation methods and methods of neutralizing harmful effects of stress. Rest and sleep contribute to optimum immune function. Good nutrition, optimum levels of vitamin D in the system, regular physical activity, all of these things. By the way, in childhood, exposure to germs is one of the ways that the immune system learns and becomes stronger. And there's a hypothesis out there that I'm a great believer in called the Hygiene Hypothesis, which states that kids who grow up in too clean environments have less well-functioning immune systems than kids grow up in dirtier environments. That there's less chance for the immune system to engage in in the struggles that really teach it and enable it to be high functioning.
So that doesn't really speak well to the whole antimicrobial hand wash.
Absolutely.
That's
I'm very
in
much
hospitals,
opposed.
schools.
You don't want to use germicidal products in general. I think that not only can they directly influence the evolution of germs in a bad direction, but they can also weaken our defensive system.
So do you think just regular washing of hands with soap and water for children, is good enough to keep their hands clean? But
I think that's fine. But kids playing in dirt, that's probably one of the ways that the immune system learns and gets better.
well, that's good to know. I spent a lot of time in dirt as a kid. So are there some, food or nutrition tips that you could give to folks? Like what would we want to eat that could help to fortify our immune system?
I think an antioxidant rich diet. So that means a wide variety of high quality fresh vegetables, especially, and fruits. And it's often the pigments in these things that have the antioxidant and protective qualities. So eating a rainbow spectrum of fresh produce daily, I think, is very useful. I think keeping sugar intake low, learning which fats are healthy, which fats are not. Personally, I think it's good to reduce consumption of animal foods and eat more of a plant-based diet. I think those are all key. And then as well, there are a number of natural products and supplements that I think are useful.
So could you give some recommendations on daily supplements?
Sure. First of all, in terms of beverages, I think tea in general is healthy. Green tea, especially matcha green tea, particularly because of its antioxidant content. Red wine, of all the alcoholic beverages, because of the pigments, probably has this protective effect. As you know, I'm a great fan of mushrooms as medicines, and Asian mushrooms particularly have immune modulating effects that strengthen resistance to infection of all kinds and to cancer. So that's species like shiitake, maitake, enoki, reishi. There's a whole range of these mushrooms that you can now get either fresh for eating or dried or in extract form. And I think that's very useful to add to the diet. Vitamin D, something's called the sunshine vitamin. It's actually a hormone that we can make in our skin on exposure to sun. But many people don't make enough vitamin D, and it's not that easy to get from diet unless you eat fortified food. So I think that's a good one to take a supplement of. I recommend 2,000 international units a day to people. Also, probably a good idea to get your vitamin D levels checked, because if they're very low, you may need much higher doses to get them up in the optimum range.
Yeah, so one of the items on the list here was definitely to talk about vitamin D.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting. I was just reading an article about some research done in the Philippines where of all of the folks that passed away from COVID-19, they found out that only 4% of the people that passed away from COVID-19 had adequate supplies of vitamin D in their system. It also stated, which was very interesting, that if the folks who got COVID-19 but had some clinical symptoms, if they were found to have adequate levels of vitamin D in their system, their clinical outcome was 20 times higher. I mean, that sounds pretty high, but it makes a case that vitamin D is obviously very important.
Now, I should also note that there's controversy about vitamin D, and there's many mainstream medical authorities who say it does nothing to protect you from viral infection, and also it's dangerous to take supplements of it. I think that you can take too much vitamin D, but 2,000 IU a day, you're perfectly safe. And we used to think that vitamin D was just necessary for bone health, but it affects lots of things, and certainly immune function, brain function, emotional health. I think it is good to have adequate vitamin D intake, and sun exposure is the best way to get it, because exposure to sun also increases vitamin D receptors in the skin, which you tend to lose as you get older. Taking a supplement doesn't do that. But in the U.S., if you live north of a line that runs through Atlanta, for half of the year, the sun is at too low an angle for you to make vitamin D. And even in where we are in Tucson, Arizona, dermatologists have made people so paranoid about the sun that everybody wears sunscreen, which blocks vitamin D synthesis. So, and even in parts of the world like Dubai, Saudi Arabia, very high rates of vitamin D deficiency, because either people are indoors or they cover up. So get your vitamin D level checked. I think a daily dose of 2,000 IU a day is good. I do think it offers protection against viral infection. And there's even reason. The one theory that why seasonal flu occurs in the winter is that that's when people are likely to be vitamin D deficient.
Are there food sources of vitamin D?
There are, but it's like, especially the main ones are fortified foods like milk that's fortified with vitamin D. Otherwise, it's, your best bet is sunshine.
So obviously during this COVID-19 pandemic, there are a lot of people that are really stressed out, very anxious, and obviously have mental fatigue just with everything going on. If you could just give a couple recommendations that could maybe help people better deal with stress and anxiety and mental difficulties right now?
Well, my main one would be to limit your exposure to news, especially television news, because what I am observing is that the people who pay most attention to that are the ones who are most angry and most anxious. And the news is designed to do that. It's designed to make you anxious and angry and become addicted to those sensations. So I think that's very important. Another is to spend time in the company of people who are calmer and more relaxed, because moods are contagious. And then I would be cautious about too much intake of caffeine, especially coffee, which I think can really provoke anxiety. I think, as we know, the healthiest form of caffeine is tea, and green tea especially, and matcha because of the L-theanine there, which has a calming effect and changes the effect of the caffeine. I also strongly recommend that people practice the 4-7-8 breath that I teach. That's like such an effective, time-effective, cost-effective method of neutralizing stress.
So what's one tip of advice you want to give folks during this incredibly unusual time? Keep your focus on the positive. This is going to end. Society is beginning to open up, and I think we have to find safe ways of doing that. Probably this cycle of the virus will run its course. There may be a second wave that comes around, and we'll have to see how we deal with that. There's a probability that enough of the population will become immune at some point that will be less of a threat, and hopefully we'll have a vaccine before too long. Well, it sounds good.
Well, we'll have to wait and see, but I think time is on our side.
I agree. Okay, that'll wrap up today's
All right.
episode of COVID-19.
Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you.